Step 5. So let's go look at the questions. How can we best prevent ourselves from forgetting information? Why is it unproductive to study things that we keep getting right? All right, let's go read. So is there a way to maintain the information you have learned after the first review testing of yourself between 8 to 24 hours? Yes, you need to continue the process of testing yourself. An initial review of material will help you become familiar with the information, but we are, as our own actors, very bad at determining if we can actually recall information, because often we think something we can, but it's simply familiar. We feel like we know it, but when we get tested, we can't remember it. To drive this point home, let us remember the names that you read earlier. I'm willing to bet that you are familiar that earlier there were some names, but you may not remember all of the 10 names. Take a moment to see and write off to the right how many of those names you remember. Then once you write these names, you can scroll up and then you can see what they were and see how many you remember. Chances are you were very familiar with the names, in fact that you read them, but you cannot recall all 10 of them from memory without scrolling up. And the reason for this is because you have not tested yourself on these names enough, specifically using spaced repetition, testing yourself multiple times over certain intervals. So it is also true that unfortunately some information, names included, are not very memorable. Like the poem earlier is much more memorable. The reason for this is that learning a name is not difficult enough. The harder something is, the better we remember it, especially when tested on it. So the more effort you have to spend to learn something, the more memorable the experience is. The difficult act of practicing recall through testing yourself is how we increase the effort and difficulty so that we can tell our reticular activating system that information is important and we want to remember it. We can increase the difficulty in many ways, and we will go deeper into these into a future lesson on desirable difficulty, but for now, let us learn how to overcome the forgetting curve. Overcoming the curve. There, on average, should be 4 reviews of the testing of the information. The first should be 10 minutes or immediately after class. Then, we should test ourselves between 8 to 24 hours after the first testing of information. We should test ourselves a week after, and a month after, on average. It doesn't need to be as far as a month. In fact, the more often you test yourself, the better. You simply don't want to test yourself too close together because it might feel like you remember it, but you don't until you've forgotten the information. So looking at the graph, we learned that on average, if we test our self-review 4 times in specific time intervals, then we will remember 80% or more information of what we previously learned after a month. That's pretty good. The optimal way to study to maximize information remembered is to test yourself between 8 to 24 hours learning something to find out what you have forgotten. You can then focus on your studying and testing of the material you have forgotten, and then test yourself on that material again as soon as you've forgotten, typically within 24 hours of the initial testing. The more you test yourself, the better, but it's important to wait for yourself to forget information so that you can actively recall that information. What this means is testing yourself 5 times in 20 minutes, it may feel productive, but if after the second time you tested yourself you were getting everything right, then of course you'll get it right on the 4th and 5th time of testing. It was much easier, but that does not mean you have trained your reticular activating system to remember it. You can only know if you remember something if you have waited 8 to 24 hours so that you have to actively spend the effort to recall it from your memory. It could be shorter, but you have to forget something to be able to remember it. Pro tip, as soon as you're getting everything right when testing yourself, switch it up to give yourself more mixed practice so it's harder, so you remember it better. We will investigate this more later. All right, so let's answer these questions. How can we best prevent ourselves from forgetting information? And why is it unproductive to study things that we keep getting right? And I will see you guys in the next section.